A good Erev Shabbos. What are we supposed to do when there's a crisis or a challenge or an unfamiliar situation? Are we supposed to simply trust in God to take care of things, all for the best? Or are we supposed to take action on our own? The answer, of course, is already in that eternal joke that we tell a couple times a week in our classes and our get-togethers. For the benefit of anyone living in a cave, we'll just remind ourselves, as the floodwaters rise, a very religious man calls out to God for help, gets no reply. The floodwaters continue to threaten, so the man goes out on his back deck so he doesn't get trapped in his house. Just then, another man in a canoe floats by and offers him a lift. "No thanks," says the religious guy, "God will take care of me." The water level rises higher, and the man climbs up on the roof. A powerboat speeds by and slows down, says, "Hey, can I give you a ride?" "No thanks, God will take care of me." Now he's sitting on the point of his roof, the tip of his roof, surrounded by waters, and he hears a helicopter overhead. They're lowering a rope and calling him, "Grab on, for dear life, we'll rescue you." "No thanks, God will provide for me." That's his last words that he's heard to say just before the flood engulfs him and sweeps him away to a watery death. He arrives soon thereafter in heaven, and he's hopping mad at the Lord of hosts. He accuses God of not listening to his prayers, ignoring his plight, letting him die. "What did you want from me?" God answers back. "I sent you a canoe. I sent you a speedboat. I sent you a helicopter. What else did you want already?" There's a more cynical and more timely version of this joke circulating now on the net about a man who trusted in God's protection rather than get the COVID vaccine. I'll leave you to work out the particulars of that joke. Not such a joke. But the question that's raised in our Parsha is really the same one that confronts us in every crisis in life, large and small. We believe in God's help. We believe in God's protection. Accordingly, what's our role in all of this? Yaakov, whose name is going to be changed in this week's Parsha to our name, Yisrael, Israel, spoiler alert. Yaakov's confronted with a crisis as the Parsha opens. It's a rather scary one at that. His brother Esav is headed his way with hundreds of men in tow, most likely seeking some kind of retribution or revenge for the incident that took place decades before, wherein Yaakov obtained the bracha of the firstborn from their father. Yaakov's understandably quite nervous, quite anxious, and he takes steps to prepare for this coming clash or encounter, whatever it's going to be. He prepares gifts to appease his brother, an attempt at diplomacy. He davens, asks Hashem for divine help, and he divides his people into several camps, which some commentators understand as preparing for battle. If one is attacked, the other will retaliate, or the other will survive. Others say it doesn't mean a preparation for battle, rather it's just hunkering down for protection. Rabbeinu Bachya, who lived in Spain in the Golden Age, writes that it's to teach us to meet our adversaries with diplomatic words and with prayers to Hashem, but dafka not to get involved in battle. Okay. Rabbi Yitzchak Arama has a different view. In his commentary called Akedas Yitzchak, he says first that God's intervention in human affairs comes about in different ways, many different ways, you should know. There's hashgacha pratit, individual personal intervention. And there's hashgacha klalit, favorable circumstances, environmental factors, also directed by Hashem, of course. And then there is the factor of the person's individual, personal intelligence, endurance, skill, energy. Very interesting point. He emphasizes that none of these is exclusively responsible for the success or failure of what we do. Human behavior is one factor. One does one's best to see that one's vision and one's plans come to be. But in a few parshas, we're going to see how the brothers' plans to sell Yosef into slavery, ultimately results in the opposite, that they become dependent on him. On the other hand, people succeed. We see it all the time, without apparently, evidently, turning to Hashem for help. Shlomo HaMelech tells us in Mishlei and Proverbs that a man who's diligent in his business will stand before kings. Chazisa ish, mehir b'malachto, he says, lifnei mlachim yisyatzev. There's such a thing as mazel. Later commentators explain that it means how the blessings descend from the higher spiritual realms down to our level where we can make use of them. We wish mazel tov, not because we believe in horoscopes, God forbid, because we want the brachas to trickle down in a full and complete and direct manner. Avraham's mazel was apparently to be childless, Rabbi Yitzchak explains, and yet he overcame it. It didn't determine. There are people who don't have such a mazal tov, and yet through their efforts and investment of energies, they manage to succeed, sometimes quite well. Gemara in Moed Katan talks about Rav Chizda and Rabbah, who had the same mazal, and yet very different lives. So Akedas Yitzhar calls the encounter in our Sedra this week between Yaakov and Esav the classic example of how to conduct yourself. He explains how Yaakov went through all the steps of proper preparation for this risky and uncertain encounter. He instructed his servants to treat Esav with respect, as befits an older brother. He sent gifts to Esav in a way that upheld his dignity. Esav should not be ashamed of a brother who hired himself out as a laborer for wages. Rather, it's quite nice. He acquired a nice fortune in that way. Yaakov divided his camp so that he would have the best chance for survival. He certainly appealed for divine help, for God's assistance through his prayers. The commentary drives home the point that this teaches us the importance of doing everything you can to ensure success. Evidently, we're not to just throw it on God, let it be God's problem. We're to take responsibility and put in all the effort, yegia they call it, all the efforts that we can, going by what we know to be the way the observable world works. So after a full string of preparations, we find Yaakov at night carrying pachim ktanim, small, maybe even insignificant items across the river. The malach, the angel, Esav's guardian, whatever it was that Yaakov wound up grappling with all night, saw this evidence that Yaakov was perhaps too concerned with things. They wound up wrestling, and at the end, Yaakov prevailed, even though he was diminished. He was wounded in the process. Even before that, we find evidence that Yaakov felt diminished, at least in his own eyes, in his own sense of self. He says, Katointi mikol achsadim, he says, I'm humbled, or literally, I'm made small, I'm diminished by all the kindnesses that God has done for me up to this point. What does that mean exactly? Gemara in Tainus elaborates on what it means, and Rashi quotes it by way of explanation. It means that Yaakov realized that God was already being kind and protective and supportive of him. At the same time, he realized that no one's merits or worthiness is boundless. So he's saying here, Katonti, I am diminished. Nismatu zechuyaisai. My merits are quite likely, quite possibly diminished on account of the kindnesses God has already done for me. I can't continue relying on these supernatural blessings. So I realize I'm going into this encounter with my brother Esav, and there's no guarantee that I'll come out in one piece. So it's quite interesting and really most instructive that Yaakov acted in the one realm where he could exercise influence and control. Himself. He could not reasonably ask God for more. He could not influence or really even know what was on Esav's mind or in his heart, what his intentions were as this encounter loomed. But what Yaakov did know is that he had the power to change himself. Rashi's expression, Hiskinatzmo shlosha devarim. He readied himself in the three ways we've discussed, with prayer, with gifts, with preparation for conflict. Hiskinatzmo also suggests that he repaired himself. He fixed himself, right? The word tikkun, repair. He made changes within himself that manifested in the outward expressions, the actions that he took of gifts and war formations and all that. Granting gifts, for example, presupposes a kind of closeness, kindness. One gives a gift to one's friend or other close person, or one you hope will become a close colleague or friend. Setting up a battle formation is the opposite. It's a result of feeling distance and danger, severity, judgment, at least on the part of the other. And then prayer, which of course asks for divine rachmanis. How can one person have three such contradictory impulses or emotions at one time in connection with an upcoming event? Perhaps that's exactly how Yaakov hiskin atzmo, what he prepared in himself, what he improved within himself. He allowed space for all these conflicting experiences and emotions of distance, of closeness at the same time, and of beseeching mercy, asking for God's help. So back to us and what we learn from this Yaakov Esav encounter and how it figures in Yaakov's life. It was anxiety-ridden, it was scary, it kept him up all night, and yet good came of it. As a result of part of this encounter anyway, the wrestling all night with the Malach, Yaakov was transformed, changed, so much so that his name even was changed. Yaakov means the supplanter. Israel is the one who wrestles with God and with man and prevails. Kisarisa imelakim vanashim v'tuchal, says the man after he blesses Yaakov with a new name. We certainly learned that that difficult and challenging situations have the potential to bring us to new stages of growth within ourselves. Just think of all the challenges that we've faced in this last 20 months and how much we've gained in resilience and inner strength. Not to mention we figured out how to operate Zoom. Even more so, the point that Yaakov / Yisrael tikein atzmo, he fixed himself, he improved himself, he expanded his inner world to be able to hold more space for more emotions and experiences, even conflicting ones, seemingly contradictory ones, and that prepared him for wrestling with the Malach of Esav, or himself, or Hashem, all night. And the result of that encounter was a new level of being and even a new name. The effects of that are still felt today at the most essential level by all of us who identify with Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, those who grapple with God and with humans and prevail. Shabbat Shalom.